Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we update ourselves concerning the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. These are conflicts that are escalating in various ways. And I want to start today with a contextual discussion around the dangers of nuclear war and the growing power of Russia. And I want to start with this discussion because over the last several weeks, as the Ukrainian situation has gotten more dangerous with the use of American and British and now French uh, uh, short-range missiles striking into Russia, guided by U.S., British, and French personnel, which have produced a situation where these countries are now co-combatants with Ukraine against Russia. And the Russian response to amend its nuclear doctrine and also to deploy the Oreshnik hypersonic missile. The response of the several high-level military officers in the United States, such as Thomas Buchanan, who is the spokesperson for the Strategic Air Command, was a rather blasé, oh yes, we can fight a nuclear war and we can win a nuclear war and still remain with a deterrent, has really sparked, I think, concern that the Western alliance is no longer as sensitive to the nuclear catastrophe as it once was, and is increasingly willing to consider deployment of tactical nuclear weapons. And so I've invited back Larry Wilkerson, who was here on the program just a couple of weeks ago. You'll remember Larry is the senior diplomat and chief of staff to Colin Powell when he was at the Pentagon, and then with Colin Powell when he became Secretary of State. Extraordinarily knowledgeable about U.S. military doctrine, U.S. Foreign policy, and is one of the leading commentators in various news channels on what's happening as we continue to try to understand the ongoing conflicts that are bringing the world closer to nuclear war than at any time certainly since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I want to welcome you to the program, Larry. And I want to start with just reading something that came out on November 17th in don't see which of the newspapers it was in, by a gentleman named Mike Whitney, who really presented some extraordinary realities that most Americans, and I would say people around the world, don't even know about, which I'd like to just simply read because it's very concise and very compelling. And then we'll have Larry comment, and then we'll enter into the updates on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine and the Middle East. He talks first about the fact that if the United States launches a nuclear decapitation strike on Russia that kills President Putin and his generals, Russia has a backup system in place that will automatically retaliate. It's called the dead hand system and is designed to collect data from sensors scattered across Russia on radiation, heat, and seismic activity, confirming a nuclear strike. If the system does not receive instructions from Moscow's command center within a given period of time, the system will automatically and autonomously launch 4,000 tactical and strategic intercontinental ballistic missiles at the United States, ensuring the complete destruction of the country and the incineration of hundreds of millions of Americans. Moscow's message is simple. Even if a preemptive strike takes out our leaders, our dead hand will still kill all of you. So, Larry, as someone who's extremely knowledgeable about this, let's just talk about this for a moment. First of all, in your view, is this true? And secondly, how do you explain the growing almost permissiveness on the part of US and NATO military leaders about the use of nuclear weapons against Russia? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. Your first point, I think, is a valid one is a valid question to ask, and my answer would be yes, they do have something like that. Um, I can't tell you whether or not it would work as advertised, but I would think that the Russians being who they are in terms of high technology, it would. There's another element to that answer, that the answer that I would give to your question on that subject. That's the submarines. Now, what does he think? Does he think that we are going to have an attack submarine on every one of their boomers in position to shoot at a critical moment like this? No, that's preposterous. And I can find you a bunch of U.S. Navy submarine skippers who will tell you that. So they're going to shoot. They're under orders. If they have a certain scenario develop, and the scenario would develop rapidly if Moscow had been obliterated, they shoot. We have the same protocol. So the submarines are virtually invulnerable. Even if there are attack subs tracking them, they know how to evade the attack subs. Some would be shot, but others would survive. And others would be in places where no one knew they were because there are places in the ocean where you can hide from any kind of sonar or any kind of visibility. So it's an absurd contention that you could conduct a first preemptive nuclear strike and then have sufficient wherewithal in your own country to ride out whatever came back. And to say that nothing would come back is just preposterous. It would. We have a system that's similar, but ours is, you would count on at least a partial democracy doing, is called COG, continuation of government. We exercise it. We exercised it thoroughly after 9/11. We know exactly who is in charge, even if it's 63 people down the line. And we know exactly how to get the codes and the so-called satchel for the nuclear weaponry and the control thereof down to that person, whether it's a surviving Congress member or a member of the cabinet or whatever. We exercise it all the way down, as I recall, to the 26th person on the list after 9/11, because we were very frightened about what might happen to our government were we to suddenly have an airplane flying to the congressional building or the White House, which was the mission, we think, of the one that crashed in Pennsylvania, was to hit the White House or the Congress. So both countries, Russia and the United States, have backup systems in case of a preemptive strike. But the insanity of a preemptive strike is, as you have suggested in your words and in your opening, no one is going to survive a nuclear war. And a nuclear war cannot be preemptively prevented for one side. It just simply can't. There's just too many rollbacks, too many backups, too many ways to get whatever you need to get on the way. And my big question would be, for example, if we hit someone that heavily and that hard preemptively, what the rest of the world, if it even came close to surviving, would do to us afterwards. I mean, there's no question in my mind we would be the absolute pariah of the world, and everyone in the world would do what they're doing now, slowly and carefully band together to balance us and destroy us. And that's economically, financially, militarily, and every other way they could. So this is just a preposterous argument. These arguments were offered by people from 1953 on. They were offered in a setting where a president or a secretary of state or a secretary of defense or indeed Rand Corporation or some other entity looking at security issues asked the question of experts, both civilian and military. And the conclusion we came to after so many years of doing the war games and doing the analysis and everything was no one wins a nuclear war, period. And this attempt to develop high technology to do so is really partly a product of the fact that we've done away with all the nuclear weapons treaties because we didn't have this kind of thinking going on, except in the extreme right wing, if you will. We didn't have this kind of thinking going on when we had nuclear weapons treaties because they gave us a certain check and balance. Reagan was not just speaking, not just blowing smoke when he said, trust but verify. Both sides believe that. There's even the Russian expression for it. And we did. We verified, and we verified to 96, 97% credibility in both sides' minds as we went through the Cold War. It was a real issue with the Berlin crisis, which I think was more serious than Cuba, and with the Cuban crisis. The Cuban crisis was just in your face and very, very in America's face, as it were, whereas Berlin was far away. But Berlin was existential for the Soviet Union. They were losing the German Democratic Republic. 10,000 people a week, 200,000 people in the last year left West Germany, well, left East Germany to go to West Germany. So they couldn't stand for that. And Kennedy knew that. And we finally got to an accommodation. We didn't help them, but we let them build the wall. We didn't challenge it. We didn't do anything about it. We let them build the wall. It took quite a while to build that entire wall, a lot of material, a lot of money, and a lot of people doing it. We didn't do a thing because we knew they had to stop that flow of Germans out of East Germany into West Germany and into the West in general, or the Russians were existentially threatened. So that's the backdrop, I guess, of what I would say about any of this business. Buchanan or his boss, General Cotton at Strategic Command, they're idiots or they're bluffing. And I think the latter, which they have attributed to Putin consistently through the war in Ukraine, that he's bluffing, he's bluffing, he's bluffing, is more dangerous than the former. If they're stupid, you can replace them and put some wise person in there, some smart person, some clever person. If they're just bluffing, they're doing it on behalf of the President of the United States. And we also discovered during the Cold War, I think decisively in the Cuban Missile Crisis, that bluffing is very, very dangerous. And you have to have channels of communications open, which Kennedy understood, which McNamara understood. Even Curtis LeMay in the Pentagon understood that, although he was all for war against Cuba. Guess what? The Russian ambassador here, Ambassador Anatov, said to me the other day, you know why we're not sending an ambassador to Washington? We haven't had a Russian ambassador in Washington for, he said, 7 months. I haven't checked the figure, but I suspect that's right. Because you won't talk to us. We don't need to send an ambassador to Washington. We usually send one of our best people to Washington. I think I was one of our best people. I was your ambassador. I left because you won't talk to us. Why should we waste a person in Washington? We have a standing order, I'm told, from President Biden. No one talks to Moscow. No one talks to Moscow. The only exception is emergencies. Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, has a phone mechanism where he can contact his counterpart if there's an emergency or something needs to be discussed in a military sense. Thank God. But we don't talk to the Russians. This is insanity.
Extraordinary, extraordinary.
Isn't it?
I'd like to go back for a moment to the chain of command in case of a decapitation strike or some kind of a disaster, because in the Constitution, it's the president, vice president, and then Speaker of the House.
Right.
So people normally think that it goes down 3, but you're saying
it goes a lot further.
It goes down to 27.
And that's because during the Cold War, when we established initially the continuity of government program, we call it COG, and all the parameters thereof, we realized that a nuclear attack would probably decimate Washington and take out much of the Congress, much of the White House. So we had to go further. And so we established, and it's in this COG document, how far it goes. I was briefed once on actually how far it went in terms of numbers, and it was staggering. I don't remember what it was, but I actually had to participate because Secretary Powell was busy and didn't want to be bothered, really. He was really buried in some really tough North Korea negotiations at the time with Vice President Cheney. So he said, "Do it, Larry." So they came and picked me up, put me in a protective mask, full mop gear, and whisked me away to a Black Hawk, and we flew to a mountain somewhere and went deep underground. And I became acting Supreme Court head, swore me in as President of the United States. I became President of the United States because the Secretary of State is in the succession and always has been. Um, and you know what I said? Jokingly, I looked around the room. I had no idea where I was. I was deep underground. That's all I knew. I looked around the room and I said, "Am I president now?" And the Navy lieutenant commander standing beside me said, "Yes, sir, you're president now." I said, "Good. My first act is to fire Donald Rumsfeld." And that got out to the Washington Post. How the hell it got out of that deep cavern to the Washington Post? But Al Kamen picked it up and put it in the Washington Post. Wilkerson becomes president and fires Roosevelt. But yeah, we have a very
Yeah.
extensive system.
And then presumably the Russians have it too, and the Chinese.
Yes,
The essential point is that there's no winnable nuclear war, that
yeah,
even if you're devastated, each country has this continuance of government apparatus and then also the mechanism for a decapitation response in reply.
yes. And the stockpiles are so robust right now. Still, during the Cold War, of course, there were 60,000 warheads, weapons on the two sides, 30,000 each, roughly. We had about 28 at the end of the Cold War. They had about 30, and we destroyed the majority of those. And one of the arguments in terms of not doing it, no one bought that argument, but the argument was made that this preponderance of weapons ensures no use because there'll always be a surfeit to do damage back. And so the argument was, well, if we get down, we were going to go down to 1,200. Gorbachev and his people agreed, and we agreed that as we were destroying Russian weapons, Soviet weapons, and our own too, that 1,200 was a reasonable bottom to go to. And then we did a study on the Joint Staff, and the Joint Staff surprised everyone by coming back, led by an Air Force officer, mind you, usually the most bloodthirsty when it comes to dropping bombs, nuclear or otherwise. They said 300 if you could work the rest of the nuclear weapon owning states into, that had more than 300 into going to that. And they made a good analytical argument for that and a very good economic argument too for it, which is what defeated it. Because nuclear weapons make a lot of money for a very narrow niche of people.
Mm.
Congressmen, senators, labs, tritium makers, missile mate. Look at the Sentinel, how much it's going to cost. It's a very lucrative niche of the military industrial complex. So we had these people coming at us like gangbusters. And we knew why they were coming at us. Colin Powell knew why they were coming at us because they were going to lose their piggy bank. They were going to lose the money that they were making. And people forget, connected with the industry is $1 billion, maybe even $1 trillion over a decade or two, nuclear waste disposal. I know a billionaire in Salt Lake City, Khosrow Somnani, who has cornered the market, so to speak, on that. And he's a billionaire. He runs the largest nuclear waste disposal program in America. This is defeating this industry would be a colossal task. They make too much money.
Well, it's within this context that I wanted to ask you about this recent Biden directive to the Pentagon to prepare for a simultaneous first strike against Russia, China, and North Korea by fitting, I think it's 1,600 missiles on submarines to be able to engage in that simultaneous first strike. How does that fit into the reality that you just discussed about the fact that there's no winnable way to engage in this war? Is it purely to satisfy the profit? Is it coming out of a mentality that actually believes it's possible to do this? Why would President Biden, under current world circumstances, direct the Pentagon to engage in this kind of preparation for simultaneous first strikes?
There are a number of answers to that, I think, and each one is more harrowing and scary than the other. One is that they're bluffing. There is a history of bluffing in the nuclear weaponry field, and it doesn't go very far because better minds stopped it and stopped it in its tracks in some cases. Dwight Eisenhower was caught in a situation where someone had to call him out. I think it was pretty easy to call him out, but Harry Truman before him and Douglas MacArthur and a host of other people who at one time or another have bluffed the use of nuclear weapons and made the bluff so realistic that it scared the bejesus out of those around them who were advising the president. But it nonetheless came across as genuine thought. Now, you can say that in one or two cases, like MacArthur's, he'd grown kind of senile. He wanted to lace the Korean Peninsula with nuclear weapons. Boom, 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 boom. And then the radioactive belt built by those explosions would keep the North from coming any further south. He actually put that proposal forward. And, the Joint Chiefs under Marshall, as I recall at the time, they essentially said, not on your life are we going to do that. But these kinds of things come out every now and then. So it could be that they're bluffing. I suspect there are some of them that are bluffing. I suspect Cannon and Buchanan, General Cannon is his boss, and Rear Admiral Buchanan is his spokesperson. And rest assured that Rear Admiral Buchanan, unless he's in jail now, would not go out and say something that his boss, General Cannon, had not approved. So I've got to think it's bluff because, second, they are just dumber than mud. And they have forgotten every lesson that we learned. They have forgotten every analytical attempt to figure out how a nuclear war would play out. They've forgotten every war game that we've ever conducted. Or they don't buy the results. If they ever read, I find it alarming today that very few flag officers in the military of any service don't read. They read memoranda that cross their desks and they read things that they send out and such, but they don't read. If you ask them who the brothers Karamazov were, they'd say, who? Or, if you ask them, and this is a particular point with me, if you ask them anything about Russian literature, they would not know what you were talking about. Well, you don't read the literature of your prominent enemy, the one you're threatening every day and bluffing against and so forth and so on. Maybe you ought to learn something about their culture. By the way, is there anybody around you that speaks Russian? No, we don't do languages in America. Other people do English. We don't do other people's languages. And I found that to be an incredible shortage in the military. Now, there's some lieutenant colonels and colonels, and now I'm told they can make it all the way to brigadier, who become attachés in places like Brasilia or Moscow. Now they perforce have to learn the language in order to do that, but otherwise it's anathema to know someone else's language. It's a waste of time to know someone else's language. How the hell can you think empathetically about an enemy if you don't speak his language? I mean, I admit that shortcoming on my own part when I don't speak the language. I don't speak Korean, for example. I always thought that was a real, not only a deficiency with regard to my ally, whom I spent some 7 or 8 years next to on the peninsula in the course of my 31 years in the military, off and on, 1 full year, and certainly a deficiency with regard to the North. And anyone who says that the South speaks the same language as the North or vice versa is crazy. It's very different. It's like going to Cuba and speaking Spanish and you learn Castilian Spanish, or going to Mexico. It's a real problem that we don't have any smart people in charge of the military, a real problem. Um, Not an unusual problem. George Marshall encountered the same thing in 1939 and 1940, and you'll find that in most of the services, they cleaned house. They had to fire a lot of the top ranking people in all the services, get them retired, get them out, because they weren't capable of doing a war. Um,
Mhm.
that's a big part of what you opened up with right now. We don't have anyone in the United States military. We don't have anyone who's fought a real war anytime lately. None,
Mhm.
zero. And people will say, well, the first Gulf War. Well, the first Gulf War was really a war for the colonels and lieutenant colonels and majors and lowers. And it was fast and furious. And it was all at the peak of American technology, buildup, and recovery from Vietnam. And ever since, we've been going downhill. And we've been really going downhill with the quality of our generals and our admirals. What was it? There was a third part of your question too, as I recall.
Well,
They're
no,
either
I think
hoping or
you answered both aspects. But
okay.
what you're saying now, Larry, leads into the next general area that I wanted to focus on, and that is again to refer to the article. Most Americans continue to believe that the United States is the greatest power on earth and will prevail in a conventional war with Russia. But that is simply not the case. For starters, Russia's state-of-the-art missile technology and missile defense systems are vastly superior to those produced by Western weapons manufacturers. Secondly, Russia can field an army of more than 1 million battle-hardened combat troops who have experienced high-intensity warfare and are prepared to engage whatever enemy they may face in the future. And third, the United States no longer has the industrial capacity to match Russia's impressive output of lethal weaponry, artillery shells, ammunition, and cutting-edge ballistic missile systems. In short, the Russian military capability far exceeds that of the United States in the areas that really count: high technology weaponry, military industrial capacity, and experienced military manpower. Uh, that is such an extraordinary reality because I think that the almost everybody in the United States and around the world assumes that the United States has the best weapons, the best military, the best industrial and economic capacity. But that seems to be not true, that Russia has now superseded the United States. And so I'd love to, and our community would love to have your comment on that, because that's an extraordinary transposition of geostrategic power, if that's true.
And what you're saying, I think more or less is unknown by the civilian leadership. Either unknown or I could say they're ignorant of it, or they've been exposed to it and refuse to believe it. And that's why they feel like they can bluff. They feel like they can bluff because they think behind them is something to support that bluff should they be called on it. There isn't. Certainly not in conventional might. There's plenty of nuclear, and that's what scares me. I think we'll be the first country, just as we were in 1945, to use a nuclear weapon in anger. And I think we're getting very close to the point where we might do that. And what you just said is going to be the realization when we do start it conventionally, because these civilian leaders who don't know anything about what you just said, very accurately said, and others are saying too, more and more
Excellent.
people are saying it, What you just said is true. And when you have 100,000 American casualties in the first 30 days, and let's just back up for a second, we have not been in a war since 1865. Not one that came to our doorstep, not one that raped, pillaged, and plundered in our fields and our farms, not one that took our cattle and our horses, not one that fired cannons into our homes and so forth. Might have been rudimentary, but it wasn't rudimentary to people who had these things happening to them. They experienced war. No American alive today has ever experienced a real war. None, period. Certainly not domestically, and I would say even overseas. They've been in conflict, but they haven't suffered a war like Ukraine. And here's my first point why what you just said is so valid, and others too are saying it. This is a remark, and I'm going to quote it because it's so powerful. This is a remark at the head of a comment made on essentially a poll that the Army does periodically to judge what the propensity to serve of American youth is. Here's the comment. As a young man in America, he wouldn't. He said no. As a young man in America reaching military recruitment age, I will say that my lack of enthusiasm to join the military doesn't come from a belief that violence is never necessary, but a recognition that any war this government wants to wage will be extremely brutal, unjust, immoral, and unnecessarily destructive. This is the first problem. That poll shows less than 9% of the 18, 24-year-old men and women in America would not serve. They have no propensity, no predilection, no desire whatsoever to serve. We had the All Volunteer Force Forum, which Major General Dennis Leach and I formed several years ago, to look at the All Volunteer Force and the problems it was having with recruiting principally. But now we've learned there are a lot more problems than just recruiting. But as we looked at it, we had a conversation one day and we said, where would they go if we had to suddenly declare conscription? Mexico and Canada, 2/3 of them immediately. Now, what is the real problem for Zelensky in Ukraine? The real problem is what Jake Sullivan said the other day, the first truth I've heard out of the Biden administration in years. He said, well, after all, Ukraine doesn't have any manpower. Bingo. We wouldn't have any manpower. So the demands will be not high-tech demands. They may be initially high-tech demands, but that'll all go away pretty quickly. Then you're in the trenches. Then you're fighting for your life. Then you're fighting for your homeland. Then the enemy's on the beach or whatever. You don't have anybody who's going to fight in this country. And people say, oh, senators will say to me when I suggest this to them, they will say, oh, no, when the enemy's on the beach, the first thing is the enemy's never going to be on the beach. They're going to destroy you before they have to get on your beach, and they won't want what they've destroyed. It is truly remarkable the change that has come over America since the greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw, I think it was, coined the phrase. But if you look out there at the people who might compose your military, you have to just say to yourself, it isn't going to happen. So I think there's a glimmer of recognition of that. And that's why we are so concentrating on our nuclear weaponry. We're doing it for the same reason, essentially, that Dwight Eisenhower did it post-World War II, because he thought 12 million men under arms would be a destabilizing force for America. He didn't want a major standing force. He was a Madisonian in that respect. And so he turned to nuclear weapons and said, well, if we're going to have a war, we'll have nuclear weapons, and we'll deter any war with nuclear weapons. Of course, part of that was sort of diffused by Korea, but Eisenhower never fell off of it. In fact, Maxwell Taylor got really angry with him about it. And Maxwell Taylor went and told Kennedy, I'll show you how to fix the military when you become president. And of course, Kennedy made Maxwell Taylor his de facto chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So we had two of them. But Max Taylor wanted to build up the conventional forces. Well, at that time, I think it was fair to say, and we did bring the draft back, and we had the draft back during much of the Cold War. It was a different country. It was a different 18 to 24-year-old profile. It's very, very different today in terms of propensity to serve, as those polls show. And I think it's very, very different when you talk about things like 1/3 of the American youth between 18 and 24 is obese and is not susceptible to being drafted unless
Mm,
you put them through a massive weight loss program beforehand. 1/3 of the American youth, 18 to 24, is intellectually incapacitated in terms of the ASVAB test you have to take to be viable for the military. It's like an entrance exam. They can't pass it. They can't pass it. So that leaves you with just 1/3 of the 18 to 24-year-old profile remaining, and they have no propensity to serve. The one reason we're not drafting, but enlisting so many women is not because we're egalitarian. There's a certain amount of that in the military. It's because we can't find the men. We have a huge proportion of women in combat roles now. And it's not necessarily what the military wanted to do, but it had to do it. Otherwise, it couldn't recruit. And I'm not saying they don't make good soldiers. It's turned out they do make good soldiers. And if it were up to me, I'd probably make women the entire military if it could be designed that way, because there aren't that many women either who can pass all the physical and other requirements for being in the military. But they do have a propensity to serve a little bit more than men. That's the straits we're in today. And I didn't even talk about the industrial base. We couldn't build like China can build. China has something like 6,000 ships in the greatest deep sea fishing fleet the world has ever seen. Most of those ships are armed. I'm not even talking about their navy. I'm talking about their fishing fleet. They can build ships at a rate that would astound you. It would look like our rate of shipbuilding in World War II, only these aren't the little tin boxes we built in World War II and floated for the duration of the war. These are sizable, sustainable craft. They're good ships, and they can build them at a rate. We don't even build ships anymore. We contract out to some other country if we want to build ships, and we do put a few together, and we build our submarines at great cost. In fact, the Congress right now is thinking about enacting the law and canceling the replacement for the ballistic missile submarines and the Ohio class replacement with the Columbia class, and the replacement for the attack sub, Los Angeles, Virginia, and vice versa. Because there's such massive cost overruns right now, and they're way behind schedule. We're thinking about extending the current boomers, the ballistic missile submarines' life 10 or 15 years, which will be expensive also and require a lot of retrofitting and such. But we're in trouble with our industrial base. Not only do we not really have one, it's corrupt as hell. It's price gouging practices, it's monopolistic practices. Raytheon, the second largest defense contractor, just merged with Lockheed, the first largest defense contractor. So imagine what Lockheed looks like now. They have the military over a barrel. So, yes, we are in trouble. Bingo. Why are we depending on nuclear weapons again?
gotcha. Gotcha. Let's talk for a moment about the Orechnik, a hypersonic missile, because that was so,
Goodbye, aircraft carriers in plural, plural. Goodbye, aircraft carriers, plural.
yeah. Talk about the characteristics of the Orechnik, because was the first point being made, that the Russians now have actually not only the industrial base and the manpower advantage, but also they're producing bigger, better, and more effective missile systems at a technological level. So it's sort of like the Orechnik is like a Sputnik moment for the United States. But unlike in the 50s where we could recoup, there isn't the capacity for the United States to catch up in any kind of a timely way.
But we just said there was. We I was in Bath, Maine, with my wife at a wedding when serendipitously they launched the Zoom wall. the new $1 billion ship for the Navy that was going to do all manner of things. And gee, when it sailed out of the ways and down the river, it looked formidable. I mean, really formidable. And then all of a sudden, within a year or two, it was judged to be a boondoggle, a complete boondoggle. Guess what we just announced we're going to do? We are going to make it a hypervelocity missile carrier. The missiles aren't made yet, but in a few years they will be developed and made, and we will make this ship nothing but a floating hypervelocity missile launcher. Now, my question immediately was, is the stealth of this ship sufficient enough to where someone won't figure out that they need to sink it right away and do so? But that's how far behind we are. Now, when you talk about the Oreshnik, you have to look at the Avangard system. The Oreshnik is peanuts compared to Avangard. Avangard goes 33,000 kilometers per hour. That's about 20,000 miles an hour. There is no known defense against that. There's really no defense against Oreshnik either because it goes pretty fast too. It's hyper also. But this Avangard system is just incredibly fast and is their ballistic missile of choice for nuclear warheads now. MIRV warheads, 8 to 10 to 12 warheads in the nose cone, each of which has 500 or so times the power of a single Nagasaki or Hiroshima bomb. They're extremely powerful bombs. And if you have a first strike weapon in your inventory, that's the one I would want. That weapon is so fast that its flight time from launch to target is in minutes. And I don't mean long minutes, I mean short minutes. It's kind of like having Cuba again, but in terms of it being fired from Moscow. You know, the real fear of missiles in Cuba, as Russia's was of ours in Turkey, is such a short flight time. A short flight time doesn't give you much time to react at all. You've either got to shoot or lose it. And that's dangerous, very dangerous. Dangerous either way. And Kennedy he's been accused of just doing what was going to happen anyway. We had planned to pull the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey, but he said, you know, in his deal with Khrushchev that he would pull the Jupiter missiles out. I don't know if that's true or not. I've looked through the archives. There's some evidence that we were going to pull them out anyway. But it was smart of Kennedy to throw that in there. I mean, even if he knew that they were going anyway. Those are the things that are so destabilizing. Why did Putin invade Ukraine? Because we were going to put missiles in eastern Ukraine that had short flight times to Moscow. And our rationale explained to Putin was that we were putting them there in order to shoot at Iranian missiles launched against Europe. Do you think Putin believed that? He knew that those carriers we were putting there, anti-ballistic missile carriers, we called them, were the same as the ones he was contemplating developing if we got out of the INF Treaty. And they could carry nuclear warheads and they could turn and shoot the other way. And that's the reason that's one of the reasons he invaded, because he didn't want that to happen and we wouldn't listen to him. So these are very destabilizing weapons. The Oreshnik, Avangard is just an incredible ballistic land-based ballistic missile. I don't know yet. I've talked to Ted Postall, and I don't pretend to understand all the physics, but I don't know yet if they have put one of the Avangard systems on a mobile system, so that, like the old SS-25s, I think they were, that drove us crazy because we could target their ballistic missiles. We could target them, and when we could feel comfortable that we had bombs enough on their ballistic missiles that we could do some real damage there. But when they put the SS-25 in the field and hit it in forest, and we understood what capacity that ballistic missile on that chassis had, it was the same thing as the one in the silo, but it was moving around. And even with satellites, you couldn't, oh, where is it now? It'd be in the forest, and you couldn't find it. So you couldn't target it. That was very destabilizing. And that's one of the reasons that Reagan made the effort to launch the Glick'em, the Pershing II, I guess it was, Pershing I's and then Pershing II's, and just drove Europe nuts, if you remember that.
I do.
In the early
I was
80s.
over there.
Yeah, they were. That's going to hit our territory. They're going to shoot us. If you put those missiles in Germany, they're going to shoot Germany. Yeah, right. So these are very destabilizing missiles, and Reshnik in that regard is even more destabilizing because it's technology that's ahead of everybody else.
Yeah. And it has the same impact of a nuclear
If you want to
warhead
shoot it, yep,
without being nuclear,
yep. If you want to shoot
just
it
because
without,
of the velocity.
yeah. And this is curious too because Putin has been very careful to send out the NOTAMs, notice to airmen, all the things you have to do when you fire a ballistic missile that are a part of a treaty regime that hasn't disappeared because you might hit a civilian airliner or something. I mean, everyone, when they fire a missile that has these kinds of missiles, tells the world. Well, Putin did that. And what was really scary after the first Oreshnik shot, which he had put this announcement out to the world about, he then, once we decided that it didn't matter, we were going to shoot the Storm Shadows and attack them anyway. Then he put out a notice all the way through 30 November. This was about Thanksgiving. He put the note. So he was saying, I'm going to shoot ballistic missiles between 28 November and 30 November. So that's going to be a lot of ballistic missiles. So, you know, he didn't apparently do it. He may have put them on alert and that sort of thing. In fact, I know he did put them on alert, very high alert, which put us on our alert. But he didn't, as far as I know, he didn't shoot anymore. But he could at any time. But he gives this warning, and that's what you're supposed to do. So thank God that at least he's doing that.
Let's turn to the manpower issue because I think this has a direct impact on what's going on in Ukraine. As I understand it, the Russians are recruiting about 30,000 new recruits a month. Their manpower now, in terms of their military, is approaching a million people under arms. And yet we keep hearing about these North Koreans.
Yeah.
And the Biden administration used the North Korean issue as a legitimation, a rationale for why we needed to then shoot missiles deep into the Russian heartland. What's the story, as you understand it, of the North Koreans? Is this a complete fabrication? Is it real? What's your understanding?
Well, first of all, it's utterly ridiculous what Biden and the administration did in response. And it's utterly ridiculous because if it was 10, 20, 30,000 North Korean soldiers not accustomed to operating with the Russians and not really accustomed to operating in that kind of terrain, particularly around Kursk, then it was not really anything to be all that concerned about. What they were concerned about, I think, was that the defense treaty between Russia and North Korea was actually being activated. You actually had an Article 5, NATO Article 5 agreement, sort of, between Pyongyang and Moscow. If I'm attacked, you'll come and help me. If you're attacked, I'll come and help you, that sort of thing. And that was in our face. You don't do those sorts of things. Only Washington has permission to do those sorts of things, and our NATO allies. Uh, how dare you do that? So he was poking his fingers in our eyes and saying, not only did I do it, look here. Now, back up for a moment. North Koreans had been exercising in the northern portions of the western part, eastern part of of Russia for some time. They get winter training with their Russian comrades up there. That's what I think this started out to be. And then Putin saw what the reaction was and that he was having what he wanted, the reaction he wanted. And so he actually moved some of them, possibly. I don't know. I've never seen any confirmation of this. No one has given me a satellite photo of a North Korean soldier on the ground anywhere around Kursk or anywhere else. They may exist. And so he may have moved some down there, but so what? It's Russia. It's Russian territory. If he wants to move some people down there, he certainly can move some people down there if they comply and they're his ally. I think that was the major point about it. But let me add, I've seen no proof of even North Koreans being anywhere near the Ukrainian border, Kursk, or anywhere else. So I don't know that it isn't just a made up deal by Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, who are really running the government now, to get some people a little more scared, a little more frightened, particularly in NATO. And oh, the hordes of North Koreans, imagine them in Paris.
Right.
Yeah. It's a tempest in a teapot, just like the ATACMS, the Storm Shadow. They're 300-kilometer weapons. But here's the kicker, and Putin's right about this kicker. They're being fired with NATO help.
Yeah.
NATO's in the war. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, NATO's in the war. The satellite data coming down to guide them and the people working them on the ground have to be US, British, French, or other NATO personnel trained in that equipment. And that's NATO in the war. He would be within his perfect right in terms of even Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right to self defense, to send an Oreshnik into a French facility or a Polish facility, probably more likely, and destroy it.
Yeah. 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 What's your understanding, Larry, of the current situation on the ground in Ukraine? There's been a lot of reports that the Russians are accelerating their advance to the west with a possible uh, uh, conquering of the territory sort of east of the Dnieper River. The Ukrainians can no longer withstand the preponderance of Russian troops. There seems to be demoralization in the Ukrainian army, confusion in Kiev, disenchantment with Zelensky. Zelensky continues to want to escalate, threatening nuclear weapons and so forth and so on. How do you understand what's actually going on in Ukraine at this moment?
First of all, Jake Sullivan was right in his admission of the truth that Ukraine can't win with the ratio of soldiers being something like 15 to 1. And it's going worse against them every day, as you just pointed out.
So for every one Ukrainian soldier now, there's about 15 Russian soldiers.
Right, right. I mean, that was Jake's figure. I suspect it's probably a little higher than that, even, because and it's because of the casualties on the Ukrainian side. It's because of the desertions on the Ukrainian side. It's because Zelensky has been unable to recruit and draft people who are wealthy. They won't let their sons and daughters be drafted. He's tried, but they've so far stood him off. It's kind of like the ultra Orthodox in Israel. And it's partly because the Russians have added enormous weight to their front lines. So the preponderance of manpower is on the Russian side. The preponderance of casualties is on the Ukrainian side. We started out with a country of at best 40 million against a country of 140 million. That, as people have said, that just doesn't work. It doesn't compute for a country with 40 million to attack a country and fight this kind of World War I type war and win. There's just no way you can win. Now, I want to take a little bit of exception to what you said about Zelensky. Um, Recently, he has made statements that would indicate to me he is very much ready, and these are to him dicey statements, daring statements, because he knows how Washington and London will abandon him fast, rapid, gone, and even have him assassinated. But he has made statements that says he's ready. And he's made statements that seem to say, I will accept de facto control of the territories where your troops are. I won't accept recognition. Putin's not about to ask for recognition because if he asks for recognition of the places where his troops are, where he's annexed, if you will, where he has de facto control, he'll lose the BRICS because one of their sacrosanct principles, particularly China, is borders are sovereign. You do not interfere with borders, period. I can't tell you how many times I talked with Chinese diplomats, including Shui Tenkai and Wang Yi, who's now their foreign minister par excellence. Um, I believe them. And people say, well, look at Taiwan. No, you don't understand. The agreement Nixon and Kissinger made with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and that the Congress eventually put into practice, the Taiwan Agreement, says we recognize there's only one China. and Taiwan is a part of China. There's no border there. So there's no border for China to cross. Let me tell you, their number one diplomatic principle in international relations is borders are sacrosanct. The most important thing the UN ever said is that borders are sacrosanct. So Putin would lose all the BRICS if he suddenly declared that he wanted recognition from them of the territory he's taken. But that's Mops Nix. He's got it. He's got it in reality. So Zelensky recognizes that. And he recognizes, and he has said it obliquely, but it comes out. I ain't going to be a member of NATO. I know that, but I need some guarantees. I need some security guarantees. Most of all, I need it from you, Washington, and I need it from NATO. I need it from all the capitals that are comprised in that organization. I need a security guarantee. I don't want to be in the future having to fend off Russia again. I think really this next point that he's ready for a ceasefire and a peace agreement that recognizes all of this and maybe has some kind of neutral force initially to enforce the division line, if you will, call it a DMZ. I think he's looking the wrong way for the interference in the future. I think Ukraine will be the one interfering with the peace, not Russia. I think Russia will be fat, dumb, and happy, if you will, to have what it's got and have the war over, cease the casualties, cease the economic layout, and so forth. I think they'll be very happy. There are some hardliners in Moscow who won't be. They'd like to see Putin take the whole country, but he doesn't want to. Let me add, though, that's an important point, though. Zelensky is sending these signals. Let me add, Clausewitz is very definitive. I think it's book 8. He's very definitive about the dynamics of war. Once it gets going, you never know where it's going to head out, where it's going to wind up. And you need to be very, very careful that your political objectives are not outstripped by your military, either through defeat or victory, too sudden a victory, too obvious a victory, whatever. And you suddenly begin altering your objectives accordingly. You either back up and retreat because you're losing, or if you are winning, as Putin is clearly doing right now, you change your objectives. Putin has never wanted Kiev. He's never wanted the bulk of Ukraine. He knows it would be impossible to govern. He knows those Ukrainian partisans would be on his case every minute of every day. He'd have those Nazis that he talks about, and there are true Nazis, the Azov Battalion, for example, would be on his troops all the time. He doesn't want that. But if we present him with a situation where he's got to destroy Kiev and maybe take much more of Ukraine in order to make his point to us, he could do it. I don't think it'd be good for either side were he to do it. But that's the dynamics of war that Clausewitz talks about. You change your policy objectives because of what's happening
as you're either winning or losing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's time to stop. It's time to stop. This is all the United States' fault. And all those dead Ukrainians, just like all those dead Gazans, women, children, dogs, cats, are at our feet. As Gidon Levy from Haaretz has said, every bomb that drops was made in the USA. Every child that dies was killed by the United States of America as well as by Israel. He's right. And we've done this in Ukraine, too. We've done this in Ukraine. And Macron is to blame and Schultz is to blame. All those leaders are to blame. But the biggest blame goes to London and Washington.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to the Middle East, Larry, because there's been some dynamic movement, ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, comes the conflagration in Syria and the insurgents taking Aleppo. How do you understand what's going on? And is there a connection between what's going on in Syria and, for example, the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel?
Always look at the empire first. The empire said to Bibi Netanyahu, why don't you get a ceasefire with Hezbollah so you can help us in Syria? Well, what are you going to do in Syria? Well, you'll see. And we need your help. Okay, so you get the ceasefire with Hezbollah. Now, it's a piecemeal ceasefire, as you've noted, because Israel's still dropping bombs all over the place. They love to drop bombs. You know, they're absolutely immune unless they have a mechanical failure. They drop these 250, 500, 750-pound bombs on civilians, basically, in cities and towns, refugee camps, hospital tents. They love dropping bombs. So they're still dropping bombs. And Hezbollah yesterday finally responded back with their own attack. But that's what got the ceasefire was our admonition to Netanyahu that we needed to do Syria. And the best way to do Syria was in conjunction with Erdogan. And so Assad needed to go still. And let me back up. In 2002, I was in the Pentagon. I was briefed on a war plan, a set of war plans. It included Iraq. Well, okay, that's the clean break strategy you're talking about? You mean that thing that you all wrote way back there in the past and talked about taking down everybody in Southwest Asia? Oh, yeah, Syria's next. Huh. Oh, Air Force three-star general briefing me on a war plan for Syria after Iraq. The plan was, Wolfowitz and the rest of them, Deputy Secretary of Defense, the plan was to take down Iraq viciously and quickly, and then take down Syria and get rid of Assad. And then ultimately, of course, we're going to take down Iran. Well, it didn't work out in Iraq, as you well know. We had a colossal insurgency, and we had to hang around and spend a lot of money and kill a lot of people. So we didn't go, but we have never divorced ourselves from the objective of getting rid of Bashar al-Assad. Doesn't matter. We're going to do it. We're going to do that clean break strategy all the way to Tehran. That's what's happening right now. And we even talked Erdogan into helping, and Erdogan was very willing to help because he wants to get rid of those people whom he thinks are threatening to Turkey. And oh, by the way, maybe I'll take a little territory too. So instead of doing what he threatened to do, which was if you go after Hezbollah on the ground, Israel, I just might come down that short little distance I have to come with the most powerful army in NATO. And it is the most powerful land army in NATO, more powerful than ours for sure. And I just might take you out. I mean, he was kind of hinting at, you know. Now what's he doing? He's in conjunction with the Israelis and the U.S. mucking around in Syria because it's in his interest, he thinks, to do so. The empire is always there, always there.
It's extraordinary.
Isn't it?
And, you know, this was something that Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State under Barack Obama, she was very instrumental in inciting the insurgents that we were fighting in Iraq to
Yes.
become allies to take out Bashar Assad.
Yes. And we created ISIS. We created ISIS. As sure as I'm sitting here talking to you, we created ISIS. We didn't give them their caliphate aspect and so forth. We just exploited it. When Abu Saab al-Zarqawi was killed, he had already started the movement of Republican Guard officers out of Iraq and into the group that would become ISIS. When ISIS was so formidable around Kirkuk, you recall, and around Mosul, I'm looking at these fire direction centers out there directing artillery fire, and I'm looking at tank formations. That ain't no ISIS Muslims. That's the Republican Guard. That's the people we pushed out of Iraq. That's the people that the first prime minister of Iraq started putting in jail and murdering because he was Shia and wanted to get revenge on the Sunnis. That's who that is. We created them. We made them. I bet if I searched around really hard, I could find out we made Al Qaeda too.
Well, you know, we funded them in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Against the Russians at that point.
Funded them and armed them.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, Larry, if I'm understanding what you're saying, the Wolfowitz, Cheney, Richard Pearl, you know, full spectrum dominance doctrine articulated in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, as it pertains both to the dismemberment of Russia and the eastward expansion of NATO, including Ukraine, and then also in the Middle East, pick off these states and then go after Iran and China. In your understanding, that mentality and that foreign and military policy formation still directs the power projection of the U.S. State Department and military.
Yes, and the only way that I can explain and live with the explanation, no matter how horrendous an explanation it is, our support for Israel and its genocide, and it clearly is a genocide, is because they're doing our work for us. That's what we feel. Lindsey Graham's right when he says if we don't support Israel, we'll have to do it. Lindsey let the cat out of the bag. Israel is doing the US's work. No matter how bloody, insane, genocidal it is, they're doing the US's work because we want to clean up the Levant. We want to clean up the Middle East for democracy's sake. Remember what that young man said? There has never been a war since World War II that was for democracy. It's all for money. It's all for brutal fighting. It's all for insanity. It's for making people rich. It's basically making the rich richer. And Lindsey Graham said, we need Ukraine too. I mean, he comes out every now and then, my old South Carolina buddy down there. He comes out with the truth every now and then. He says, all those riches that are in Ukraine, we want them.
Yeah, the
Don't you understand, American people? We're out there killing people for you.
Do you see any of this changing under Trump?
I had hopes because he spoke from time to time, like he did before the first time he was president, about the Iraq War. He made some very cogent comments about the second Iraq War. He said it was stupid, it was illegal, it was crazy, it was dumb, it was expensive, and it didn't accomplish a thing. All true. But he's so mercurial. And look at the people he's picking. He's picking 3/4 of the people he picked are card-carrying neoconservatives, or worse. Christian nationalists who want Christianity to be the national religion and to hell with anybody who's anything else. Listen to some of Pete Hegseth, his nominee for Secretary of Defense. Listen to some of his speeches to Jewish organizations. They will chill you to the bone. The Jews are the chosen people of God, and we are their helpers. We must stay together. We must do what's necessary to fulfill the Bible. It scares me a lot more than his womanizing and his drinking.
Yeah, yeah. It's ultimately in that position, it's his politics.
Yes.
Where does this end? How does this play out in your mind if the neocons continue to have this kind of a hold on the Congress and the White House and the military and the foreign policy establishment? How does this end?
Well, it ends with the most arrogant, hubristic, bristling with opponents from one end of the globe to the other empire on the face of the earth at the present time, or it ends with our destruction. I wanted to think for a long time while I was teaching this, 16 years on 2 campuses, 6 at George Washington and 16 at William and Mary. I wanted to think that the discussions that I and my very bright students had were more optimistic and positive because we all talked about finding an off-ramp. We called it an off-ramp from empire, a way to do not necessarily what the empire did on which the sun never set. After 1956 and the Suez Crisis, the British had to pretty much say, we aren't imperial anymore and pull their reins in, you know.
The sun finally set.
Yeah, the sun finally set. So we said, how do we find that off-ramp? Well, how do we become Paris into Paris? You know, an equal amongst equal, certainly with China, probably India, Russia. How do we become a country that gets along in the world, has a lot of power, a surfeit of power, financial and otherwise, but nonetheless doesn't do all this war making and everything? And we thought we could craft certain ways that you could do that. And we tried. And then we saw the stupidity and we saw the absolute inanity, the dumbness, if you will, of leader after leader after leader, Congress after Congress after Congress. And then we saw Trump. And it was like a comedian had come in to, bring in the clowns. Remember that song, Bring in the Clowns? It's the end. Bring in the clowns. It's the end. I don't know. I think we have so much economic power that we could lie around for a long time. But even that is becoming very, very dubious because $50.2 trillion in aggregate GDP, in aggregate debt by 2032, the CBO says. Our interest payments on our debt this year are $1 trillion.
It's
CBO
bigger
says,
than our defense budget.
yes, CBO says by 11 years, they predict that that 50.2 trillion aggregate debt will cost us Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the defense budget all combined in interest payments. How do we survive that? Well, we just keep printing money. Well, that's not a recipe for long-term health. There is a reckoning a coming, and it isn't Armageddon, I hope. It might be a nuclear Armageddon, but it isn't God descending to Christ descending to the earth and killing all the unbelievers. It's humans doing themselves in.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, this is very sobering to take in that the United States is as out of touch with the reality geostrategically.
I like to compare it to Jeremiah telling the Israelites over and over and over again that they couldn't be what they were and hope to survive. And then Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed them and enslaved them. Well, I don't know if there's a Nebuchadnezzar out there for us. It might be called nuclear weapons, or it could be called climate change. But there's a looming disaster in our future.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And how we all as citizens navigate through that chaos is a
Most of us put our heads down and keep on working and earning a paycheck and eating 3 meals a day if we can, and that's the extent of our interest.
Well, one of the things we do with Humanity Rising is we emphasize sessions like this, but also how we can empower ourselves in the midst of this kind of crisis to at least live authentic lives and make whatever small difference we can in whatever world we inhabit. And so I really want to thank you, Larry, for your truth telling today, because these are hard truths, everyone. It's hard to take in that nuclear war is being contemplated against the reality of mutual assured destruction. It's hard to take in that the United States is not number one in every category of human endeavor, but is now slipping into a subordinate status. And it's hard to take in that the neocons are still in power when the history shows one catastrophic failure after another. And yet we still maintain the deep patriotic commitment to a world that never was and can never be. And so, as we close, Larry, I just love to have you as an elder taking all this in. What would be your counsel to our community, to just people of goodwill out there who understand what you're saying and are a little uncertain as to how to understand and how to navigate through this? What's your counsel?
I get that question a lot all across the country. And usually what I say is we, the people, that Lincoln-esque phrase, have to take our republic back. And the only way to do that is through the ballot box or violence. It doesn't have to be violence that occasions overthrow of government and bombs and bullets and such, but it may have to be more like violence than it is like nonviolence. I just don't know. Read the Declaration of Independence. There is a time when people have to do something about their government, and when their government is so bad that there isn't anything you can do through the normal processes, then you probably have to take to the street or whatever. It's going to take a combination of things if we are to save this republic. I'm not even sure republic is the right definition anymore. It's an oligarchy, is what it is. Um, it's hard. My students puzzled over this all the time. How do you, knowing that they were leaving, and as many of them would say, with a home mortgage on our back because of student debt, knowing that we're leaving and going into this world, what would you recommend we do, Professor? Or, let's sit down and talk about it. But we never came up with anything. I think this is fair to say. We never came up with anything that was broadly satisfying.
Mhm.
Because it just seems so insurmountable, the problems. And when you look at the history of empires, there have been thousands of empires. They're all gone. Um, it's very sad. It's very dismal when you think about the Eastern Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, the Mogul, the Mongol, the British, the Third Reich. These empires didn't last very long. Some lasted longer than others. The Persian lasted arguably for a very long time and was very powerful, but they all went. And they all went roughly in similar ways, with decadence, with arrogance, with hubris, with others around them moving to balance them because they were sick and tired of them. Um, it's not an optimistic history when you look at imperial history, whether you look at modern empires or past empires over the last 3,000 years. They're all gone, all gone. One of the common deficiencies is at the end or in the end is really bad leadership.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we have that in spades.
In every branch of government. We even have a Supreme Court that's polluted.
Mhm, mhm. Well, Larry, thank you for your wisdom and clarity today. I really have appreciated this discussion. I hope to have you back down the trail as world events unfold. This will bring us to a close, everyone. You're welcome to join the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. You received the link in your Zoom reminder for today. And then tomorrow, we're going to be exploring the Jaguar path with Ray and Nina Christ as one of the pathways that people can inculcate within themselves to empower their internal fortitude for the challenges of our lifetime. Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you, everyone. See
Really,
you.
one more comment.
Yeah.
My wife, before she passed, reminded me of a mantra that she lived by. And it didn't matter who was in charge, it was individual with her: kindness and courage.
Yes. Kindness and courage. In the end, kindness and courage. Thank you, my friend.
Really,
Thank you,
take care.
everyone.
Bye bye.
Kindness and courage.